Okay, last part of chapter 10. We talked about ended up with the Monroe Doctrine and foreign policy. When it came to politics at home, there was kind of the facade of one-party politics, although nobody really altogether agreed with each other. The presidential candidates in 1824, had several different candidates. Crawford, who was a radical, included some of the old Republicans. He's also part of the Virginia dynasty. Was devoted to states' rights. He was very much in strict interpretation of the Constitution. Calhoun and Jackson were nominated by Pennsylvania. Jackson had avoided a lot of commitment to issues and really just pulls on his popularity from things like the Battle of New Orleans and his military record. Clay was nominated by Kentucky and really favors and promotes his American system of politics. And John Quincy Adams was nominated. He's very similar to Henry Clay, but less on the tariff side. But otherwise, most of his policies will align very closely with Henry Clay's. For the corrupt bargain, when the election happened, as you can see on the screen, nobody had the majority of votes, and so per the Constitution, when that happens, the presidential vote or election gets decided by the House of Representatives. Well, at that point, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House, and he basically becomes president maker. He gets to have the most influence on who is going to be president, so he pulls all of his weight and promotes John Quincy Adams. And when John Quincy Adams wins the presidency, even though if you look at the numbers, Andrew Jackson had the most electoral and popular vote. And so if they were to look at just the numbers, they probably would have voted in Jackson. But because Henry Clay moved most of his support over to John Quincy Adams, and for him it really was justified by the fact that Adams did have very similar policies to Clay, embodied most of what Clay liked with the American system. And so it made sense that, he would align himself with the person whose politics were the most like his own. And when he does this, John Quincy Adams wins the presidency and then makes Henry Clay the Speaker of the House, which some people said was very, not Speaker of the House, Secretary of State. And so some people said it was very negative, it was very corrupt, and it gives Adams this kind of black cloud to start out his presidency with. He was very intellectual. He's very focused on central government making internal improvements. He wanted a national university. He wanted to finance scientific explorations. He's very much an intellectual. But he had some bad choices of wording, and people thought he might be a monarchist. People began to split and emerge to support Jackson. They basically began campaigning for Andrew Jackson the minute that he lost 1824 for the next election in 1828. Panic of 1819 was a hard time to try to discredit Adams, proposing tariffs. Later on, this plan that they had with these high tariffs does actually pass and ends up becoming the Tariff of 1828, which you'll read about in Chapter 11, that caused a lot of problems between Calhoun and Jackson and states' rights and those who did not support states' rights issues. But we'll get to that next chapter. Election of Jackson is going to happen. A lot of people say that it was more of a revolution than the election of 1800 because of the changes that brought with Jackson. New campaign styles, because this was the time of democracy and trying to make things more democratic, and many states had begun to move towards universal suffrage for all men, at least all white men. People are starting to start to campaign differently, really starting to attract more towards their entertainment value or their personal qualities, starting to transform here at this point. But there's a lot of attacking of each other and each other's families and wives that doesn't really do very well later on. In the election, they started promoting the idea of democracy. Jackson was the common man's president. Suffrage is, like I said, it's going to be suffrage, which is the right to vote, expanded to more men, and getting more people involved in politics was a goal of Andrew Jackson. So he will win the election of 1828. He becomes the symbol of democracy, the man of the people, because he did start from very humble beginnings and becomes very successful. So people take that as an inspiration, and we will look more at Andrew Jackson in the next chapter.